Tonight we have Tarik from the Center for Community Progress. He is the Director of National Technical Assistance, and he will be speaking on strategic code enforcement, a critical tool for achieving safe, healthy, and vital neighborhoods. He will first talk about an overview of underlying forces, move on to key preventive systems. Next, he'll talk about traditional versus strategic code enforcement. He'll touch on policy and practice tips to consider, and then leave room for discussion. The Center for Community Progress has a mission to foster strong, equitable communities where vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties are transformed into assets for neighborhoods and the neighbors. They work with over 300 communities in over 35 states. They have a goal of policy and practice change at a local, state, and federal level. Some services that they offer to effect change through customized expert support, such as technical assistance, policy design, research, trainings, conferences, learning exchanges, and online learning. The Center for Community Progress has a deep commitment in New York State. From 2010 to 2011, they supported the creation of New York Land Bank Act. 2011 to 2012, they assisted ESD with land bank programming. 2012 to 2013, they brainstormed with the Attorney General through the Land Bank Grant Program. 2014 to present, they supported the New York Land Bank Association, and from 2015 to 2017, they helped the Office of the Attorney General design new grant programs. From 2015 to present day, they offer multiple fee-for-service engagements with local municipalities and land banks across New York. I'll pass it over to Tarik, who will pick up with an overview of underlying forces.
I think the most important thing to set the stage is that really looking at these underlying forces, right? This is not just about property, not even about policies and practices or capacity. These underlying forces, first, we just need to understand. As you can see, these are major population changes in 4 upstate New York counties and in the principal cities. You can see a massive migration out of the urban core and large increases in the county population, but then also out of the county and out of the state altogether. But this leaves an extremely imbalanced housing inventory where supply and demand are just completely out of whack. Okay? You can see these double-digit decreases from 1950 to 2010. Again, it's going to leave us an imbalance of supply and demand in our housing. Clearly, under those conditions, we want to think about prevention and preservation, but obviously demolition is going to be a part. And how do we also replace some of these obsolescence housing? And then now, as we're trying to attract young professionals, new businesses, families, sometimes just the products on the market really aren't enough to attract folks. But the reality is that the underlying economics are presenting major challenge, the poverty, the lack of resources, and then, of course, the entire neighborhood market. It's very difficult to justify investing $150,000 or $100,000 into a home that could barely sell for $50,000 when it's done. So we have to look at these underlying economics, and then they're all exacerbated by these systems that really are broken. So we focus on these key systems that touch vacancy and abandonment. We help local governments break the siloed data infrastructure that exists in every community. We work on code enforcement systems, delinquent property tax systems, and then land banks. I do want to be honest, many of the challenges are almost going to be exacerbated in smaller rural communities. Many of these tools to tackle systemic vacancy are urban-centric, right? We even lack more resources. We don't have full-time dedicated officers, so these challenges just become even more pressing. But there are still insights to share, and I think that regionalism is definitely key. Not only to address vacant and abandoned properties, but regionalism has been a community development and economic development, and even a public service delivery model for rural communities for quite some time. So I think I always laughed when the governor said that we would have to share our services better. Meanwhile, the rural communities and smaller, we were already doing that. Right? We are experts at making the best of minimum resources. Right? We know that a property owner has two primary responsibilities: keep up with your repairs, keep up with your taxes. Obviously, there are many owners that face financial hardship, they lose a job, they experience a health crisis, and maybe they fall behind, right? So these systems that we use to ensure compliance, what we do work with communities is, one, make sure they're equitable off-ramps, right? And there's no reason to criminalize poverty with a code enforcement system that is all about punishment. And at the same time, we don't want to take someone's property through the tax foreclosure process just because the 2 years, lack of work, the economic collapse, that they're unable or they fall behind. So one, we want equitable off-ramps. But where we find that there are owners that have walked away, the owner has died and it's been passed through the heirs and it's trapped in this legal limbo, where banks are not paying too much attention, where it's an outside investor and speculator that is basically walked away from the asset. We want these two systems to work differently. Instead of compliance, because we're not getting it, we now want to use these two legal systems to fire the owner. Basically, we have the equitable off-ramps, we're respecting the property rights, but now that we see that this property owner's negligence is causing harm to neighbors, to the neighborhood, is presenting safety hazards, we're going to fire the owner. And it's these two systems you can use to push the property to temporary public ownership and then get those out to a more responsible owner. What happens generally is, whether it's code lien enforcement or tax lien enforcement, that property comes into City Hall. So many governments would just immediately auction them off as fast as possible. They wanted no responsibility of property ownership. The problem is, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, is some of the owners that are causing problems in some of your small towns or neighborhoods are the ones that often show up to the auction and buy these properties for $10,000 cash. It is a system that offers opportunities for some folks that are going to do good work, but it's also a system that attracts some of the bottom feeders, right? And you have no control. And so what we've also done is innovate this model called the land bank and granting it special powers through state enabling legislation to play a better, more transparent and accountable role of those properties that fall into the public safety net, right? That come down and we're firing the owner, we're going to take temporary stewardship, and now we're going to get that back out with predictable outcomes, with the responsible owners, and in projects that advance our community priorities, right? So this just shows how all these systems should be tied together. Using our data to better understand where the properties that are causing most harm are located, what tools we're going to bring to bear, where we want to be more equitable and supportive in that early process, but where we find out that it is a negligent owner that is causing harm to our neighbors and neighborhoods, we're going to fire them through these different tools, bring it under temporary public ownership, and get it back out to the community in a productive use with a response. So you know this, right? Code enforcement is not just inspectors. Unfortunately, the public sees it that way. Why are the code officers doing nothing? The garbage has been there for 5 days, or the junk vehicle, right? I heard it all the time. But you are just one piece of a much larger system of laws and policies, practices, governance itself, right? The ultimate goal is to enforce minimum standards for healthy and safe neighborhoods for all. The problem is that we rely entirely on go out, cite the owner, issue the violation. If it's not cleaned up in a certain amount of time, we send it to court, and then we bang our head against the wall because there are so many barriers to achieving efficient and effective outcomes and resolution through that process. And worse, some of the people that do show up are the folks in your community that want to do the right thing, but might not have the resources to do it. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to pursue criminal prosecution and enforcement and levy fines against somebody who, again, wants to be a responsible community member, but is facing hardship. It puts you all in a really uncomfortable and unenviable position. We know that some of the worst property owners are exactly those entities that are almost impossible to resolve and to hold accountable. LLCs, particularly out-of-state LLCs, in our community, we now have foreign LLCs that are buying rental properties. We are never going to be able to hold them accountable if there's code violations, if we approach it through traditional code enforcement. Same thing with banks, zombie properties, air properties. I know you all have probably experienced the challenges of each type of these properties. And as I mentioned, criminal enforcement, really inefficient, really ineffective with many of these certain kind of entities, particularly corporate entities. You can't necessarily bring them into court. So what do we mean then when we say let's switch to strategic code enforcement? Well, it's really about compliance. Obviously, that's always the goal. We want to change our practices, our policies, and approach, right? Not just the way the inspector operates, but all of it, right? So this couldn't be possible unless you are joined by political leaders, by resource allocation, by maybe even organizational restructuring or new partnership. But the goal is to change the threshold of expectations for owning property in the greater Mohawk Valley region, right? Such that owners now have to say, okay, I'm not going to ignore you. I know I can't do that in the Mohawk Valley region. So how much time do I have to comply? And the equitable part is to also be mindful of, but I could really use a little help. We need to develop better programs and practices around accommodating them. We're going to hear at the third presentation from John McCracken from the city of Elmira. Small city, lack of resources, but they went all in on really having a data-driven approach, and you're going to hear some of the amazing work that they've been able to do. We want to look at data because once we better understand the property profile and what the barrier is, what the challenge is, we're going to deploy our toolbox separately, right? And there are some that maybe are just delinquent taxes. We have a pretty good tax enforcement foreclosure system in New York State and across the counties in Mohawk Valley. 2-3 years, we bring that under public ownership. But maybe it's a question of zombie properties. Maybe they're tax compliant, but they are completely vacant and could actually be moved through the 19A abandonment proceeding, right? So we have to know what are the data, the parcel data cues and triggers on each of the problems that are or the properties that are causing the most property, because they will help define what tool we're going to bring to bear. Obviously, we want to talk to residents, right? Social data is really important. And of course, in larger urban settings, market data becomes very helpful. You also can't do this work alone, as I mentioned, right? Code enforcement, and particularly as that first slide showed, you are one pipeline, one link in this chain of building a more comprehensive approach to vacancy and abandonment. So we start with the data, and then here's the full cycle of property revitalization. Where we can prevent vacant and abandoned properties, obviously we want to do that, right? Using code enforcement, property tax, keeping people compliant with their responsibilities, resourcing CBOs and nonprofits to help seniors with roof repair, etc., investing in the neighborhood. Where though we're going to have those problem properties, we then want efficient systems that can acquire and maintain them. And under public temporary stewardship, we believe is the best, because then you have the greatest chance to steer that property towards the predictable outcomes that are going to achieve the safe, vital, healthy neighborhoods you all want and that your constituents deserve. So what really then does strategic code enforcement mean? I'm not going to lie, it is a complete paradigm shift. There is not a single code enforcement department across the country that is deploying all of these key elements. But there are some that are doing some of them incredibly well. And I think over the next 5-10 years, we are going to see a much, quicker and accelerated transition to a more strategic, people-centered approach to code enforcement. One, obviously, using your data, accurately diagnosing the problem. Don't just throw folks out there, right? Data is our friend that can guide our resources most thoughtfully. We want to make sure that we have a suite of programs, laws, and tools, right, that are flexible. That's the whole thing about equitable. Equitable means that there might be some owners that need to be treated a little differently. And we know in code enforcement, lawyers are always saying everyone has to be treated equally. Everyone has to be treated equally. Well, you can actually treat folks equitably. And that's recognizing, just as we do in the tax system, where we offer exemptions for certain vulnerable folks because we know they have financial hardship. We can do the same in approaching strategic code enforcement. I mentioned before, you're going to need to be linked to the land bank, linked to different community development, linked to MVED, linked to some of your neighborhood groups, right? That is how you're going to approach really moving the needle and addressing vacant abandoned property in your municipalities. Again, cross-sector partnerships, and I've heard it, in Rochester, there is an absolutely national model of rental inspection program that was driven entirely by a principal of an elementary school where we saw lead poisoning among children in a school was really harming the academic performance, and he was shocked at how many incidents. And so built an entire coalition and got entire community buy-in towards moving towards rental inspection to address specifically childhood health and lead poisoning. What the code officer, the director who's been at the head of that program for decades, he said, give me an enforcement officer with excellent interpersonal problem-solving skills. I'll train up the rest. But it really is, this is key to looking at strategic code enforcement. A lot of times, you know this, you're almost serving as a social worker, hoarders with mental health issues, right? Folks that are dealing with financial insecurity, stress, depression. It is not easy, and you can't do that alone, but having those interpersonal problem-solving skills, recognizing that you're a resource rather than an adversary, hoping to achieve compliance, and if needed, bringing in the help for those who want to do it. Right? We definitely still want our process that's efficient and effective, and the outcomes are equitable. You're going to need a bit more capacity. There's no question. All code enforcement departments across this country are going to need capacity. Fortunately, with the ARPA dollars, the federal funding that went to all 19,000 jurisdictions across the country, we're seeing more and more communities that are peeling off a portion of those funds to boost their capacity in code enforcement, to purchase new IT software systems that are going to help with their recovery efforts, all of them eligible activities. And so I think we're going to see some really interesting program design towards this more strategic code enforcement approach. And then obviously define, measure, and report your successes. It's so key. You're really showing how the work you do is making an impact. So quickly, we're going to talk about some tips to consider, and then I want to make time for questions. We said, look, adopting a locally appropriate equity first framework. It really just challenges folks to think about what is the intent of code enforcement. The intent is compliance. Compliance needs more than just the hammer and the gavel in the courtroom. It's building trust with the community. It's repositioning inspectors to be a resource and not an adversary. Going up with a hand card of places that they can reach out to locally instead of a violation notice on day one. It's trying to think about how we avoid those unintended consequences, and obviously always driven by outcome. And this really, traditional code enforcement is not that effective in addressing deferred maintenance, particularly where we have higher levels of poverty, and where some of those maintenance repairs, again, are so costly that they would exceed whatever the property owner could get back by putting that property on the market. So these economic underlying factors are really going to present a barrier to sometimes getting compliance. So what about providing them some compliance manuals? What are the top 10 violations that all owners should know about, right? And what are some small, simple ways that they can maintain in compliance? How do we present that as being a good neighbor, right? Instead of here are the violations, is hey, here are the 10 things that homeowners often slip by, but if we all work together, we can have safer neighborhoods. And here's a list of resources that maybe you can tap if you're having challenges meeting some of these common home ownership or property ownership issues. There are a lot of programs across the country that have been investing resources in doing this. And again, that's where we are seeing some of these ARPA dollars, the federal dollars that come to every county and even municipalities, small municipalities in your region. They're using some of these dollars to assist homeowners with essential health and safety repairs, all eligible under the Treasury's interim rule. Housing during COVID was literally a life and death public health safety measure, right? It took on a whole new meaning of how to keep people housed, how do we advance housing security. So as we're dealing with health and safety violations inside homes, as we're dealing with leaking roofs, the ARPA dollars can certainly be deployed towards those areas, especially in neighborhoods where there's higher rates of poverty, and that would be an eligible expense. Obviously, rental housing has also been at risk, right? Where there are all these programs across the country. They are in larger urban cities where they have more resources. So I've been trying to be cognizant of the group I'm talking with, and I know those challenges in upstate New York and rural communities. So thinking this is where we're seeing those ARPA federal dollars being directed towards code enforcement strategies. They recognize that public health safety, when under COVID, keeping people housed was a life or death public safety health measure, right? Your role took on whole new implications. And we wanted to make sure that people stayed in their homes. Many tenants and even some older homeowners are in properties that might have some significant health and safety concerns and challenges. And that's where some local governments have decided to spend their ARPA funding. Instead of citing you for code violations as part of our recovery effort, as part of the public health safety measure, we're going to bring dollars to help you do the repairs. Sometimes grants, sometimes matching grants, but this could be a great opportunity to make similar investments in the Mohawk Valley. One, we know you are in a horrible position, often between tenants and landlords. You are put in the middle of a dispute. That is not your role. You haven't been trained to be a facilitator, right? This is also why some of those interpersonal and different trainings really should be designed for code officers. But this is difficult, right? And so we know that the best approach is, instead of waiting for complaint-driven enforcement, particularly when it comes to rental housing, is to be proactive and to roll out a rental inspection program. Now, it sounds very difficult for rural counties, but Amira is going to talk about, again, how with a small investment, because they had such an excellent, significant, robust data ecosystem, they knew exactly the top 100 properties they were going to inspect first. Yes, it may take 5 years to roll it out, but they used the data to determine where the inspections would create the greatest impact when it comes to health and safety. Now, with any kind of approach with rental housing, right, think about your work instead of unintended consequences of involuntary displacement. Hey, government officials, you also need to fund programs to assist with relocation, right? Throwing you out there to do the work without building a resource relocation assistance program is incredibly inequitable and can be harmful to some of the most vulnerable occupants in your community, right? Instead of leaving them subject to retaliatory evictions, many tenants don't want to call code because they'd rather deal with substandard housing, even health and safety issues, than be evicted by their landlord, particularly during COVID-19, right? And so instead of leaving them subject to that, hey, let's invest in some legal aid, some right to counsel. Some other communities are using their ARPA dollars, again, to kind of build that ecosystem, because they know if they go and start doing more periodic inspections, they're inevitably going to find more properties that do not meet basic health and safety habitability standards. And so building up these other programs with equity in mind is essential to ensuring that you are not the cause for more displacement or homelessness in your community. The last thing I want to say is there are some great rental inspection programs. These are examples. Again, I know it's harder for rural communities, so I do want to offer a couple suggestions, and we will finish up and go to questions. One, consider a regional training program of neighbors, right? There's great township of Waterford, Michigan, which they did a neighborhood preservation for. Who in the region, maybe a CBO, maybe the land bank, could play that role of designing that program, right? And working with many of your residents and getting them engaged, eyes on the ground to help track those. And instead then of always relying on the code enforcement, we're seeing some communities actually deputizing, so to speak, the residents. Not that they have official enforcement and legal authority, but it's they first reach out to their neighbor, right? With a, hey neighbor, I live right down the street, wondering if you could fix that. We don't want to get caught up in the code. You know, it's really changing the response rate, just changing the language on your violation notices. We worked with a firm in Detroit, just changing the language to be more friendly, to be more supportive and positive. Changed compliance rates by 18%, just from language changes. It's just amazing. You obviously have a lot of lessons from the Zombie Grant projects and the Cities Rise initiative. So hopefully more learning across the state would be really helpful. Seeing how small increase in capacity can yield these outsized gains. Stories that our elected leaders, particularly those at the county level, really need to hear as they think about their budget priorities every year. And then using Article 19A, so excited that Nick Palace is going to be able to touch on that and walk you through that, but maybe building a top 10 list across the county where there's not tax delinquency, but there's clearly vacancy and abandonment. Build your list of the 10 that are causing the most harm, and then make that a campaign, right? Knocking 10 out in 2022. And using the land bank as kind of a regional entity that can serve as a resource for not just land banking as that public steward, but also playing more of a role with the data and supporting code enforcement, supporting those community-driven strategies. Really, that regional approach is key, and the land bank could become your hub. The goal of bringing and finishing with this slide was to show you how all of these systems need to be linked together, right? Better understanding your inventory, even prioritizing just top 10 or top 20 to go after, ensuring that you have the right tools, that you have the equitable off-ramps, that your municipalities investing not just in punitive enforcement, but also supportive compliance approaches. And that pump about bringing that property under public ownership temporarily in a process of firing the owner because you care for the health, the safety, and vitality of the neighbors and the neighborhoods that are being harmed by that negligent, irresponsible, many times out of area owner, right, that has externalized the cost of property ownership onto all of the neighbors. It's just not right. And thinking about how the land bank then can play that role. So basically, your work in the field, doing code enforcement, right? And instead of going after the owner, just going after the property, citing them, hey, if you don't mow the lawn or clean it up, we're going to have it cleaned up in 5 days, bill you. If you don't pay it, we're going to put it on your tax bill. If you don't pay that, then we're going to fire you. We're going to use the tax lien enforcement process, and we're going to bring that under public ownership. All of these need to be connected, and understanding that you each play a vital role in achieving, I think, the goal that we all want, which is safer, healthier, more vital. I'd also love to hear feedback. I mean, we present and work with rural communities, but it's certainly not as frequent as when we work with urban communities. So I would love to hear folks like critical, constructive feedback. Is there something that we should change, rethink? Was there something that wasn't too helpful? That would also be greatly appreciated.
Okay, sounds good. So I'll provide your email address, and hopefully we'll you'll hear some feedback after the fact. Thanks so much, Tarik.
Wonderful. Well, have a great event, and thanks everybody for coming. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.